Hello again. Once again, this is Stephen Flanders, and going to be changing formats. This is not 15 Minutes to Save America. This is going more to just what's going to be a regular show. I guess How and Why to Save America is going to be the title of the show. This first is going to be kind of a denouement. Denouement is how I used to pronounce it until I got informed that it's denouement. Kind of the conclusion and summing up, picking up some loose ends from everything that's gone before and kind of where we're going next. First subject I want to hit on is this control of the press that resulted from the Telegraph. I don't know how much people can read between the lines, but I need to fill in some of the blanks. The fact that nobody reported on this shouldn't be that much of a mystery to people. Reporters in the field, even editors sitting at their desk, are not under the impression that there's some big conspiracy. It may not have been so much of a conspiracy. They just know they're going to write stories that get printed. And nobody was really wanting them to print the fact that, some stories about rich people weren't getting printed. So the rich slowly coming to dominate the press was such a slow process. Very few people saw it. Very few people thought about it. And those that did probably were in favor of it, thought it was a good idea. And so, that's why that quote, I think it was in the 7th episode from William Allen White, who was a newspaper man and who in 1924 wrote the biography of Woodrow Wilson. And for reasons of that day, talked about how the people in 1901 saw that there was a plutocracy coming to rule us. And they were wondering whether or not it was going to be moral enough to take over the world like they saw that it might be able to. Well, in 1924, because I think he wanted the League of Nations to be, stood up and used against said plutocracy, he admitted it in that book. But I bet you go back to his newspaper in 1901 or 1895, you won't find him warning the people about a plutocracy coming to dominate the country. That's something that was talked about behind closed doors, but wasn't really something that showed up in the press. So it amounts to kind of a cover-up of the rise of corporate personhood. Now, what did happen in the press, the big event that we know of today was the Haymarket Square riot, which was May 4th, 1886. And the Haymarket Square riot took place in Chicago. There was some labor unrest going on, a big public gathering there, and the police came in to break it up. Well, somebody threw a stick of dynamite into the phalanx of cops, killing 6 of them. That's what really launched that riot, okay? That was May 4th, 1886. The ruling about corporate personhood was handed down from the Supreme Court on May 10th of 1886. So all the oxygen, all the controversy about corporations and labor rights and everything was swept up in thinking about the Haymarket Square riot. What were the rights of workers versus the powers of corporations? And nobody was looking at this obscure Supreme Court ruling, and they didn't look at it. It really didn't come into public notice until Hugo Black along about 1925, 1930, and he got rewarded with the Supreme Court nomination for his troubles, and the issue went back into obscurity. But with the rise of corporate personhood, you had the old despotic, the traditional despotic arrangement of the very wealthy combining with the very powerful, kind of a hand-in-glove operation that existed down through the ages. But because of the lack of press notice, and that, if somebody had noticed corporate personhood rising, first of all, they'd have been a really smart reporter. And if they did notice it and felt like this was a battle to be fought and started raising enough of a howl to get noticed, they very likely died. I mean, you're talking people with billions of dollars knowing exactly where their bread is buttered, having set the stage for corporate personhood, doing it in an underhanded way, accomplishing their task in a quiet manner. And they probably weren't going to be putting up with one or two reporters doing anything about it. So if somebody was smart enough to figure it out, that's all the further it went. But the upshot was that the rising corporate personhood, the rising plutocracy that William Allen White noted was a fait accompli by 1901. And so apathy was the big result. People felt like, well, you can't fight it. Don't do anything about it. Now that leads to point number 2 in this denouement. The first big objection people have raised to this entire agenda of local community moral self-government and the open media and how to actually solve our problems, get back to being America as designed, is they say, that's a good idea, I guess, but people are just too apathetic. You'll never get it. Ha, 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 ha. Trump card to play. Hey, you can't do anything. People are too apathetic. And of course, they're correct. People are apathetic. And over the years, I've gotten angry about that and thought of it as cowardice. I no longer think of it as cowardice as much as demoralization. And demoralization has 2 meanings. It can mean people just have lost enthusiasm, and that certainly follows. But I think the deeper meaning is the one I'm using, is that people have lost sight of why to be moral. They've become demoralized. And therefore, apathy is the real wisdom of the day. I first started running into this problem long about 1975 when I got out of the Navy. Now, harken back to 1970, 1971, just before I went into the Navy. And I went into the Navy even though I was against the war. I'm still glad my father talked me into it, and I listened to him. But the people I was running with were against the war, and the number one comment of the day, the meme of the day, and maybe people will admit to it, but come the revolution. Come the revolution. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. Everything's going to be fixed. Come the revolution. Come the revolution. Okay? I went into the Navy. Everybody else kept talking like that, I suppose, until I was in the Navy. I wasn't conversant with a lot of the people at that moment, all the folks back home. By the time I got out in 1975, nobody talking about revolution. I think it pretty much faded the day the draft ended. And then as the Vietnam War wound down, it's just like, okay, it's over. Everybody wasn't threatened anymore. My point about that is this whole agenda, local community moral self-government, restoration of the Constitution, and doing it by way of the open media, I've never imagined since long about 1977 when I realized we're not going to talk people into being aroused. People weren't ready for a revolution because people had talked them into it back in 1969. They were ready to change things because they felt threatened. They were aroused because of issues and threats, okay? They felt like you're going to be drug off the streets and put in combat, okay? They were against that. They didn't like fighting for a war they didn't believe in. They didn't like the whole civil rights thing being, people's civil rights having been violated, and they were questioning the legitimacy and goodness of the country. So revolution was in the air. It all got dissipated, okay? But what I came to realize about 1977 is you don't talk people into being aroused. Ideas aren't what gets people aroused. What happens is you want to put ideas out there so that when that moment of crunch comes, when there is a crisis that must be responded to, you have laid the ideological and philosophical basis for actually making a good change. That's what this is about. Okay? There's going to come a moment when we're being offered some kind of choice. Okay, there's going to be a couple of alternatives were offered, which is either watch and suffer the country falling into total chaos, or submit to some sort of deep authoritarianism. That they will be seen that there's just one of two choices: either it all falls apart, or we've got to allow a dictatorship because we've proven that freedom doesn't work. That's basically what's being foisted on us right now. That's the moment in time that this is being written toward, so that people have it in their mind. There's a third alternative. We could go back to being America, which would not be chaotic, which would not be anarchistic, but which would also not be authoritarian. That's what this is being written for. That's what to hold on to and why to do it. And the thing is, and this is the third point. I'm putting up three fingers, so I'll know where to edit to change the graphic underneath. Of the three alternatives, the most likely is we will get incited and induced into some kind of real large-scale civic confrontation, civil war. The reason for that is there's a lot of foreign and alien powers that have a great deal of sway in our country right now. I mean, look at the H-1B visas. Look at what China can get away with. Look at what the globalists can get away with. And as far as I can tell, if it was up to our anointed elite, they'd open the gates and let these foreign powers come in. Okay, it doesn't seem like they really stand up to it at all, but there's one thing that's keeping them from it. In order to understand that, you need to go back to Sun Tzu, which is a Chinese philosopher that wrote The Art of War. Now, the one point I retained from that book is don't engage in kinetic battles unless you're sure you can win. Well, the problem with all these foreign powers having corrupted and taken over our government is that the people in this country still possess 400 million guns. Probably more than 400 million these days. That happens to be the largest army ever assembled. Some general sitting in Beijing or whatever country, I don't want to lay it all on China, but just assume that they're ideologically thinking along these lines. Some general sitting in Beijing, sitting there going, yeah, we can go in, their corrupt officials will let us get whatever we want. But the minute we step foot on that country, as the Japanese general said, there's going to be a gun behind every blade of grass. We're not sure we can win that. So, according to Sun Tzu, let's leave it alone. Well, because of that, and because they have a lot of power over our cultural institutions, the universities, the media, whatever you want to name, the number one strategy is to neutralize all our guns, and the way to do that is to get us into civil war. Well, you stop and think between the lines a little. Stop and think a little, people. You're not going to be spoon-fed every conclusion. You're going to have to actually think. The fact that all these really powerful international interests are trying to incite a civil war in this country, does that go a little way toward explaining why we're so divided? Why our media seems to be working to divide us at every turn? Why our cultural leaders seem to be going along with the divisive spirit? Why every issue seems to be couched along terms that either, our side has to win everything or we lose everything. Every issue, we just have to be at each other's throats. We can't find any reasonable solutions. And that goes right along with the elitism, the consolidation of all these powers at the federal government. Everything works along the same lines. But keep in mind that the big thing, the big goal short term for these people is to incite us into civil war. Because if we launch ourselves into a civil war over really nothing, all of this talk about a national divorce and maybe we should be two different nations and blah, blah, blah. It's all about nothing because all of it, everything about us that is divided culturally can and should be accommodated by returning to local community moral self-government. There's absolutely none of these issues that couldn't be worked out by bringing the powers of self-government back to the states and allowing people to govern themselves in their own states, in their own communities. That's the big point about that. But by disguising that from us and keeping us from thinking along those lines, they will hope to get us into a civil war over really nothing. And by getting us to fight each other, really in pitched battles and everything, they neutralize those weapons. Okay. And then if some foreign force comes in, designated as peacekeepers or whatever, half of us would be fighting to defend them. That would neutralize those arms. That would then also, with that kind of horror coming down on us, we would be easily persuaded into accepting an increasingly totalitarian government because we would feel we could no longer keep the peace within ourselves. And that then leads me to my fourth point in this denouement, which I don't know how long it's going to take. I'm just going on, and that's how I'm going to operate from now on. I'm not going to try and fit it into 15 minutes. I'm going to make sure and try and fit it into, have it fill the time that I have to fill, which is, I think, the slow decline of the United States and the fact that, even now they're taking their time. Time is working against them, but they're taking their time because they don't want us to remember what we're really like when we are free and self-governing, okay? When the country falls, if we let it fall, when it falls, it's going to fall hard, but the conventional wisdom that the powers that be want to come out of the fall is not just that the United States was a bad idea, but that self-government is a bad idea. That you let people govern themselves without the elites controlling them, and they're going to end up being immoral, incapable of doing the right thing. They're going to end up just like America did, like we always thought of when I was a kid, of Rome. It ended up being debauched with orgies and a complete decline to morals. Well, that was Rome after the fall of the Republic, yes, okay? You got bread and circuses, and the people became more and more debauched. Same thing has happened with us. The Republic is hanging by a thread, and we've become increasingly demoralized and debauched. But it was because we lost self-government. That's why it happened in Rome, too. But it really, with us, why we've fallen so far morally is because we've lost the powers of moral self-government. And that's what they want us to forget. The thing I remembered recently, because, people will say, well, he thinks, it's okay. Everybody's going to act, a lot of people will say, it's, you're remembering a time that never was, even though they ignore the fact that we did end slavery. We did have a great many moral reforms that spirit continues today. But back before the 1930s, and before Franklin Roosevelt started instituting real socialism, there wasn't a great need for a federal medical control and provision of medical services because there were so many thousands, if not millions, of young people that dedicated their lives to service. This is absolutely true. We've lost sight of this. The hospitals used to be staffed by people who had dedicated their lives to community service. Teachers weren't the most well-paid people in the community. But most people throughout the country, their identity was wrapped more into their community than how much money they had as an individual. That just happens to be true. And it really can be verified by looking at how many people used to enter holy orders with Catholics, with Anglicans, with missions in the Protestant churches. How many hospitals are named after religious denominations? I know in Lutheran Hospital, Presbyterian Hospital, St. Joseph's Hospital, all kinds of St. Luke's, all kinds of religious orders and denominations founded hospitals, staffed them with people that were working for near room and board. They weren't getting rich, and a huge percentage of people lived their lives in that idealistic mode, living as members of community and dedicated communities to providing services, to educating the children of the poor. Okay, there was really that sense of community and heightened moral consciousness on the part of the people when we were free. That's what's necessary to remember, because as we come into this time and they start trying to put America and more important, liberty into the dustbin of history. The one thing they're wanting us to do is forget that liberty really does raise our thinking. They want us to come away with the conclusion that look what happened when people were free. Only that moral decline was forced on us by usurping the First Amendment, by usurping the powers of moral self-government, and insisting that these morally depraved values be taught and foisted on us in our communities. And that's what we shouldn't lose sight of. We need to remember what kind of people we became when we were free. That's why they're going so slow. That's what they want us to forget. And their control of the media and the control of the education will enable them to continue to push that narrative, which is why I'm doing this, putting this out there. And I'm saying the real antidote to this is to provide a forum for freedom through establishing an open media. Everybody says, my friends say, well, you need to make sure people are subscribing and following you. Yeah, that'd be great. I guess there's money to be made on YouTube if I get enough followers. I don't even know how to do that. I want people to share it. And if you really do think freedom is an idea worth preserving, and that maybe this country should get back to its roots, share this. Don't rely on some leader. Whoever you would rely on got a real problem. They're gonna die. No matter who you're talking about. No matter how good you think they are, they're gonna die. And if that's the only hope you have is that person, well, your hope is going to die too. Put your hope in ideas and in the idea of liberty and defend that and look for people that will stand up and uphold liberty. And thank you, and please do share. Yeah, subscribe. That'd be great. Talk to you later.